Hospital. I interviewed the 8 principal surgeons who treated President Kennedy that day. There's extensive interviews with them in the book, and they're very important ones because they finally clear up this purported contradiction about the medical evidence between the treating physicians at Parkland, the autopsy physicians at Bethesda. There is no contradiction between these two, and the doctors at Parkland are overwhelming in their support of the autopsy findings, 2 shots that hit them only from the rear.
My guest is Gerald Posner. The book Case Closed, Lee Harvey Oswald and the Assassination of JFK, published by Random House. Our number, 703-418-1500. Gerald Posner will be with us for the next 45 minutes, so we want to hear your comments and questions. I'm Carol Preston, sitting in for Jim Bohannon. Back with more after these messages. We're back on the Bohannon Show. I'm Carol Preston, sitting in for Jim, who has the night off. Our number, 703-418-1500. There are many of you who want to talk to Gerald Posner, and we want to get as many of you on as possible, so please keep your questions and comments to the point so that he has a chance to respond to everyone who is trying to call. We were discussing during the break just very quickly about how, with most fallen heroes, we celebrate their life by remembering their birthday, but with Kennedy, many of us don't even know when his birthday is. I believe it's in May, but I certainly couldn't give you the date, and we only remember his death.
Yeah, absolutely. And Teddy Kennedy has been asking for a few years for us to try to remember him on his birthday, not on the commemoration of his death.
Let's move on. Houston, Texas. You're on with Gerald Posner.
Yes, I was interested in your chapter on the Clinton witnesses.
Right. Clinton, just so I can tell the listeners, is a small, dusty backwater town in Louisiana where 6 witnesses came forward and testified in the Jim Garrison trial in the late 1960s that they had seen Lee Harvey Oswald together with David Ferry, a so-called adventurer, soldier of fortune, and probably Clay Shaw, who was head of the Trade Mart, or Guy Bannister, an ex-FBI agent with crime connections.
Okay, with that background, caller, go ahead.
Yeah, one of the statements you cited was from an aunt. I wondered if you realized that was a separate person from the William Dunn who testified at the trial.
Right, Andrew Dunn, given, as a matter of fact, it was listed as Andrew Dunn in the original statements to the investigators for Garrison and given as that statement in an affidavit.
And that Andrew Dunn was reported to have hanged himself in police custody in the summer of 1968 before the Shaw trial came down.
Right, but these are from 1966 statements to the Garrison people. What he's referring to is, I found what I call the so-called lost files of Jim Garrison, statements from his investigators, statements by the Clinton witnesses, and affidavits from the Clinton witnesses, including Mr. Dunn and others, that I think, and I discussed this at length, that invalidate the very heart of the Clinton story. The Clinton story is now included in what I call the director's cut, the expanded version of JFK. He's included as yet another evidence of conspiracy, and the House Select Committee talked to these witnesses and thought they were essentially credible, but they didn't have the benefit of these documents, which I think are very important on the record.
Thank you very much, Mid-Plains. We'll move on now to Sarasota, Florida. You're on with Gerald Posner.
Yes, I just have a lot of trouble with the single bullet, the pristine bullet that had to have gone through Kennedy's neck, Connolly's body, his wrist, shattering a bone, and ending up in his leg, and coming out in perfect condition on a stretcher, especially when Jack Ruby was supposed to have been at the Parkland Hospital and then denied that he was there, and Zeth Cantor said that he personally talked to him.
Okay, a couple of things on that. First of all, very, very important on the bullet, and I can't emphasize this enough. First of all, the bullet is not pristine. You know, Dr. Michael Bohannon, who was the chief forensics doctor for the House Select Committee, saying that a bullet is almost pristine is like saying a woman is almost pregnant. She's either pregnant or not. The bullet's either pristine or it's damaged. This is a damaged bullet. It's flattened more than you could if you put it into a vise and squeezed it. It's flattened so much that the end is punctured out and the lead core has actually been pushed out. But it is in what I call good condition for a bullet that inflicts all the wounds because, as we discussed before with Carol, it slows up as it goes through the body, and this is very important. Fast enough, and I have charts on this in the book, based upon the latest ballistics evidence, which give you the exact speeds the bullet is moving as it goes through different parts of Kennedy and Connolly, and then reconstruct those in physical experiments with pictures of the bullet. If you have doubts about the single bullet, which most people do, I suggest you look at this. One last thing. Jack Ruby at Parkland Hospital. I agree. I disagree with the Warren Commission. Ruby was at Parkland. He did stop by that day. He did see Zeth Cantor. But that bullet had absolutely no connection to him, and I show why it did not when I go through that material.
Okay, my apologies. Let's now move to Mid-Plains, California. I thanked you for the call before you had a chance to get on.
Yeah.
You're on now.
Right, actually, it's Mid-Pines.
Mid-Plains.
Pines, like a tree.
Oh, Mid-Pines.
Yeah, now you got it.
Get my hearing checked.
Hi, God, there's so many things that one could bring up, but, and I'm at a disadvantage because I missed the first hour due to your being on an hour earlier than the program.
Well, why don't you pick what's most pressing?
Yeah, you may have addressed this already, but, one of the flaws that I have always felt was, in the Warren Commission theory, which I gather that you're basically supporting the Warren Commission.
I agree with their conclusion, but I disagree with a lot the Commission did and condemned them for pretty sloppy work and some big mistakes.
Yeah, that's pretty much what I expected. Okay, here's one of the main flaws that I've always seen. The idea that Lee Harvey Oswald, who, from what I have read and seen, was not a truly expert sharpshooter, was able to shoot this particular type of rifle, a rather inferior type of rifle, as fast as he could with the accuracy that's claimed, and hit, 2 out of 2 shots. How on earth do you back that up?
Right.
We did touch upon that.
We did talk about it,
if
but
you could very quickly
absolutely.
review.
Not only, first of all, and you have to look at this, based upon new enhancements from the Zapruder film, he had 8.5 seconds, 8.4 seconds to fire 2 shots in the assassination. He fires the first, and then he has 3.5 to the second shot, and another 5 to the third. And I must tell you something. What's interesting here is people say it was a terrible shot, the rifle wasn't good. This was an effective killing weapon. It was used in World War II. It fires a bullet at 2,000 feet a second, the same speed as an AK-47 fires a bullet. It has a bullet that's incredibly heavy for its length, 1.25 inches, 160 grains. It's like a flying drill when it gets going. And I talked to his brother, who says he used to go out hunting with Lee Harvey Oswald. He used to pick off squirrel and varmint all the time when they were running across the field. He never missed his game. I talked to Marino, who said he used to sit on a porch in New Orleans for hours at a time, practicing with the bolt action of the rifle so that he was as fast as possible with it. And this is key. People say he was an expert, and I agree. You don't have to be an expert marksman to pull off what he did. He had 3 shots. Now, let's go over it. 1 misses. That's not very good. 1 isn't lethal. It hits Kennedy in the high neck shoulder, but Kennedy survives that. Only 1 shot does the trick for Oswald. That's the 3rd shot. Although it's the farthest away, the driver is panicked. He's turned around. It's clear on the Zapruder film. He's looking at President Kennedy. Kennedy is lolled a little bit to the left with his head. Oswald fires the shot when Kennedy is a sitting duck. And what happens? That bullet almost misses. It catches Kennedy in the high portion of the head, 1 inch higher, and Kennedy lives. So I agree. He wasn't wonderful, but he was good enough on that day and the serendipity that takes place to be able to kill the president.
And he had more time than anyone originally thought. The book is Case Closed, Lee Harvey Oswald, The Assassination of JFK by Random House. These are the publishers. If you want to get it, you can get it in most major bookstores or order it at 1-800-831-8900. Charge it to any major credit card. It will be signed by the author. Our number here tonight, now, 703-418-1500. I'm Carol Preston, sitting in for Jim Bohannon, and back with more of your calls after these messages. We're back on the Jim Bohannon Show. I'm Carol Preston for Jim, and we're getting right back to your phone calls. And let's get underway with Monterey, California. Hello.
Hello. I have 3 points. I'll try to make it brief. First, in response to Carol's opening remarks, ironically, Mr. Posner also made this point. Since consensus represents the view held by most, and since the vast majority of Americans believe that there was a conspiracy, we do indeed have a consensus that there was a conspiracy. And the second point is that on the Jim Bohannon Show recently, when Jim Bohannon was in Dallas, he had on the show one of the doctors who examined JFK at Parkland Hospital, and that doctor says that JFK was hit from the front. And, in effect, Mr. Posner is arguing with an expert who was there at the time. And finally, the last point is that Oswald's connections with the intelligence community were what led him to fake that left-wing activity that was mentioned earlier.
Okay, 3 points. I'm glad they're all raised because, and the last 2 especially, are points that are often come up. Regarding the consensus, a belief in a conspiracy, if we allow major issues in this country of historical importance to be decided by majority opinion, we're going to be in trouble on a lot of issues. And I must tell you that it's not surprising to me that 80 or 90% of the American public thinks something's fishy in the Kennedy assassination, because for 30 years we have only had one side of the case presented to us, that of conspiracy, in 2,000 books and articles and documentaries and in a $50 million propaganda film by Oliver Stone. So it's no wonder we think it happens to be a conspiracy.
What about the doctor?
The doctor is Dr. Crenshaw, Dr. Charles Crenshaw. He was a young resident at Parkland Hospital. He came in the last few minutes of President Kennedy's treatment. He held the bag in intravenous treatment. He did not see the neck wound at all because a tracheostomy had already been done. I speak to the other doctors who were there. Most of them don't even recall him there, although he was there for a few minutes at the end. And they absolutely contradict his statements that there was a hole in the back of Kennedy's head. Kennedy was never turned over. The doctors never examined him, and they never saw that. And I must say, although I believe he believes that, he's certainly mistaken in the belief. Third and last point, Oswald's connections to intelligence agencies. I looked into this extensively. They are non-existent. He did not have a file at the CIA. He had a 201 file, which is a file of interest in him. I have information from this book from the KGB files for the first time. I have the first ever interview with Oswald's KGB handler, Yuri Nosenko. The KGB files are key on determining this point. They watched him for 2 years when he was in Minsk, day and night, and they concluded he had no intelligence contacts to American intelligence. He was, in fact, the eccentric loner he looked like.
Okay, let's try to get one more call in from the break. Albany, New York, you have about 20 to 30 seconds here. Go.
Okay, briefly, is Kennedy's wardrobe still available in the archives, and what about
what do you think happened to his brain matter?
Absolutely. As a matter of fact, the wardrobe is still available. It's there for inspection. You can write a letter and see it. And I'll tell you what I think happened to the brain. On this, I agree with the House Select Committee that Robert Kennedy, who was absolutely petrified that it would be part of a gruesome public display in years to come, buried it together with Jack Kennedy at Arlington. I'm convinced it's been interred with the grave, and the family will never allow that material to come out. It's one of the problems that we turn the evidence over in a murder investigation to the victim's family. It should never have been done.
We never hear from the Kennedys. We never heard from Jacqueline Kennedy and or her children.
No, I think it's very smart. I think she's avoided this becoming a part of her life and never-ending questions from the press by saying that I will not speak about it, nor will my children. And it's given her some semblance of privacy and peace, as opposed to having to deal with constant questions.
My guest is Gerald Posner, author of what is already a very controversial book, Case Closed, Lee Harvey Oswald and the Assassination of JFK. By the way, this coming weekend, you'll see it number 11 on the New York Times bestseller list, and it is one of probably a dozen that will come out on this 30th anniversary coming up of the assassination of John Fitzgerald Kennedy. I'm Carol Preston, sitting in for Jim Bohannon. More of your phone calls at 703-418-1500 after the break on the Mutual Broadcasting System. Carol Preston here with you tonight on the Jim Bohannon Show on this Tuesday night, Wednesday morning. My guest, Gerald Posner, author of Case Closed, Lee Harvey Oswald and the Assassination of JFK. Let's get right back to your phone calls. And we kick off this half hour with Auburn, Alabama. Hello.
Hi, Mr. Posner.
Well, hello.
I'm going to shoot off a bunch of questions, and they're short ones with short answers. If Oswald was such a loser, why did, in the KGB, assessed him as such? Why did Marina, who had a KGB uncle, end up kind of married to him and off to the U.S. with very smooth immigration? Next, George de Merenshield, very strange relationship they had, I think, an aristocratic Russian, and who had CIA connections, supposedly. You can straighten me out on that if there is one. Oswald's Bannister ferry connection with the Civil Air Patrol and Camp Street connection. And why didn't Oswald shoot the straight shot? And will you debate Mark Lane or somebody who can really test you instead of, like getting spoon-fed by Dick Cavett the other night?
Absolutely. As a matter of fact, let me start in reverse. I had, about 2 weeks ago, on national radio, CBS, 2 hours, half an hour, Mark Lane came out swinging at me and tried everything he could to shoot holes in the book. And then came Gaydon Fonzie, who's a House Select Committee investigator, has a new book coming out this fall that says the CIA was probably behind it. Then came David Lifton, who you probably know is the author of Best Evidence, that said the president's body was stolen and had body alteration. And then came Jim Mars, who was one of the books used by Oliver Stone. So for 2 hours, I dealt with 4 of the leading conspiracy theorists who have books out or are about to have one published. And I say all the time, I'm very happy. I hope that Oliver Stone at one point will sit down and debate this. He was supposed to be the other night on Crossfire on CNN. Instead, Dr. Cyril Wecht, who believes it's a conspiracy, a forensics pathologist, debated me. So I'm happy to debate in any forum people about this, including Dick Cavett, but certainly those who have a much more advocacy position.
What about Marina's marriage?
Marina's marriage, okay, I mean, just in the quick order, I'll go down to it if I can. Okay. If Oswald, the KGB looked at Oswald because they were afraid that even though he appeared to be mentally defective to them, that he could be an American sleeper agent, and they said in essence, and it's in his file, maybe he's just pretending to be crazy. And what they concluded in the end, it wasn't an act, this was actually him. You said that Marina had a KGB uncle. No, actually he worked for the equivalent of the local militia. The best analogy to the United States is like that of a policeman. Not a KGB uncle whatsoever, clearly not on the KGB files. George de Mohrenschildt was Oswald's only friend in America probably at any time. When you say that he was CIA connections, what he actually did is de Mohrenschildt was debriefed, as were 25,000 other Americans, by the CIA's OVERDOM, the Domestic Contact Division, for travel abroad, and he'd been to Yugoslavia and he was a geologist. Actually, I go into their relationship in some detail in the book, and what appears to be an unusual one, Oswald the loser and de Mohrenschildt the baron, is not so unusual. They really share an outcast perspective on life and very much share leftist politics. Bannister and Ferry. Bannister, the ex-FBI agent, Ferry, the soldier of fortune. I spend almost a chapter on this in the book, both on what you said is 544 Camp Street, the office that they shared where Oswald had stamped on one of his leaflets, as well as the Civil Air Patrol where Ferry had been a commander and Oswald was a member at 15. I prove, to the extent that you can prove a negative, that Oswald never knew either of these men and never met them. It disproves the heart of the conspiracy theory. I show you that he never, in fact, was in the Civil Air Patrol when Ferry was there, and that the whole testimony tying into Guy Bannister and 544 Camp Street which is Bannister Secretary Delphine Roberts, is absolutely not credible. I interview her.
Wait, let me just ask you, how do the conspiracy theorists come up with a connection? And we see it very clearly in the Oliver Stone movie.
They say that when Lee Harvey Oswald was 15 years old, he was in the Civil Air Patrol in New Orleans, and that David Ferrie was a commander in the Civil Air Patrol. Absolutely true. But the problem is that I went back and got the original records. I don't know why these weren't available to the House Select Committee in the late 70s that show that Ferrie was suspended from the Civil Air Patrol a year before Oswald came in and didn't come in until 3 years after. They based the relationship with Bannister on the word of Delphine Roberts, who was Bannister's secretary. I interviewed her. She also thinks that she saw the Ark of the Covenant and the Sacred Scrolls a couple of years ago. One last point. You said, why didn't he take the straight shot? The shot as the car comes up toward the depository along Houston Street. 2 reasons. First of all, talk to shooters, and they will tell you that it's harder to shoot at a target coming at you when you're using a telescopic sight because the target keeps dropping underneath your telescope as opposed to when it's moving away from you. It's easier to keep the scope on it. But the last and most important point, the position Oswald creates on the 6th floor to shoot down Elm Street, he can't be seen by the neighboring buildings, the Dowtex and the Records building. If he's shooting down Houston Street, as you call it, the straight shot, the 2 buildings next to him with people hanging out the windows can look directly at him, and he's probably going to be caught at Dealey Plaza.
Let's move ahead to Dayton, Ohio. You're on with Gerald Posner.
Yes, Mr. Posner, this is John in Dayton, Ohio. I have a very important question for you concerning the Secret Service. In the Mary Mormon photo, we can see Mr. Kellerman with his finger to his ear 1 second before the driver, Mr. Greer, shoots the president. Now, this is photograph evidence. What do you think of this?
Okay, very interesting. I mean, you say 1 moment before Mr. Greer shoots the president. This goes back to something we were discussing before, Carol, how I said that some people believe that William Greer, the driver of the limousine, the oldest member of the Secret Service detail, obviously John ascribes to this theory, turned around and shot the president with a revolver, and he believes that Mr. Kellerman, who's the Secret Service agent also in the front seat next to Mr. Greer, had his hand to his ear. Therefore, he must have been giving a signal to somebody else on the Secret Service assassin team to turn around and shoot the president. This all relies on the belief that somehow the driver of the limousine turned around, and although he shot the president, the governor never said a word, Nellie never said a word, Jackie never said a word, and the hundreds of witnesses at Dealey Plaza never saw it happen.
Let's go on to Murraysville, Pennsylvania with Gerald Posner. Murraysville?
Yes.
You're on.
Hello.
Hello. You need to turn your radio down.
No, I don't have my radio
Okay,
on.
Go ahead.
But I was just listening to him answer a question, and all of a sudden you broke in. Here's the situation. Mr. Posner?
Yes, I'm here.
All right. I'm going to ask you 2 questions that everyone that I've asked these questions to has either refused to answer them, waved them aside, or denied the facts.
All right.
All right. Oswald, when he was a child, had an operation. He had an operation right behind his ear, a mastoid operation. As you know, that leaves an enormous depression behind the ear, which cannot be missed by any doctor under any conditions. In fact, anybody looking at him would see it.
What's the question?
The question is, why is it that the body of Oswald did not have this mastoid operation?
The mastoid operation here's the key fact on this, does not leave a scar that can be spotted. I will tell you something on this. It's very interesting. Now, hold on a moment, please. Remember, I did a book also on Joseph Mengele, and he had osteomyelitis when he was a kid, and people said that would leave a scar as well, and when forensics doctors looked at the skeleton, there was no scar left on the bone. It varies with person to person, and this is key. Here's what the caller is saying, Carol. In 1980, Marina Oswald joined an effort to exhume Lee Harvey Oswald's body from its grave because she believed that, in fact, he may be a KGB double impersonating Oswald, and that, therefore, what they were going to pull out of the grave when they did the forensics examination was not the real Oswald, but was, in fact, a defector. Now, under this theory, a KGB agent, under this theory, the KGB agent returned with her from Moscow and fooled his brother and his mother to think that he was really Lee Harvey Oswald, even though Marguerite Oswald had defended her son, said, that's my real son, and his brother said, that's my real brother. We now think that maybe it was a KGB agent. So what he's saying is the forensics doctors who did the test on the corpse and conclude 100% certainty that, in fact, that was Oswald, how did they miss this mastoid scar in the back? They discussed this. They looked at Oswald's records. They conclude, based upon his dental charts and the skeleton and all the marks that should be on the body, there's absolutely no question the corpse in that grave belongs to Oswald. But I will tell you what some conspiracy theorists do. They say, how do we know that the corpse of the real Oswald wasn't swapped back into the grave before we took it out to do the forensics test? So in the end, there may be no answering some of these questions.
703-418-1500 is our number. We have about 20 minutes remaining with Gerald Posner to talk about JFK and the fact that Posner has concluded that Lee Harvey Oswald was indeed the lone gunman on that fateful day in 1963. I'm Carol Preston, sitting in for Jim Bohannon. Back after these messages. We're back on the Jim Bohannon Show. I'm Carol Preston, sitting in for Jim, and we'll get back to your phone calls. Let's move along to Puerto Rico. You're on with Gerald Posner.
Yes, I want to know is or was a Texan?
I'm sorry, can you repeat the question?
I want to know is the Iowa is or was a Texan?
Oswald was a Texan.
Yes, I mean he was born in New Orleans, but he moved back and forth to Texas and New Orleans with his mother while he was growing up, and then moved back to Texas after he defected to the Soviet Union and came back to America. He lived there for a year before he went to New Orleans, and then he lived in Texas for 2 months before the assassination.
Thank you very much. And now to Scranton, Pennsylvania.
Yeah, I remember that interview that Dr. Crenshaw gave with Jim Bohannon last week. And he specifically stated he saw that body before the tracheotomy.
Right.
And the tracheotomy that was performed was not as extreme as the later photos showed when they from Bethesda.
And I'm glad you raised both those points. First of all, there are only 5 doctors who saw that neck wound before the tracheotomy was performed. I spoke to all 5 of them, and Dr. Crenshaw was not in the room, and they're adamant about that. And no other doctor was there before that tracheotomy was performed because it was performed very early. But more importantly than that, Dr. Crenshaw says that the tracheotomy is bigger in the pictures than he's seen than what was done down at Parkland. You know what? I went back to the doctor who performed the tracheotomy, Dr. Malcolm Perry. He hasn't given an interview in 20 years, and he spoke to me for the first time because he said, I'm sick of all this material about how our information gets on the record and gets distorted. I said, Dr. Perry, and I include this in the book, is that tracheotomy that you see in the autopsy pictures the same as the tracheotomy you performed? And he said, yes, tracheostomies are not pretty items. You do them rapidly. You have to do them fast. It's the same as I remember cutting. So here's Dr. Crenshaw, who says the tracheotomy looks different to me than the opening I recall, yet the doctor who did it says absolutely not.
Why would Crenshaw say that he was there before if, in fact, he weren't?
The only thing I can say, I certainly am not saying that Dr. Crenshaw's lying. I don't mean that. But I think he's mistaken. You know, sometimes in these emergency situations, your memory gets compressed. So what I'm saying is, I'm weighing the evidence, and I have to give the weight of the evidence to the other doctors who disagree with him just by their sheer numbers. I'm talking about 7 or 8 doctors on the other side that say Dr. Crenshaw is mistaken. So I believe he's saying this in good faith. This is his memory. This is as he remembers it. But I just don't think he's right.
Our number is 703-418-1500, and we move ahead to Little Rock. You're on with Gerald Posner.
Yeah, I have a question about the Zapruder film with the physics that in the film that show the fatal headshot throwing the president backward and toward his left, which would suggest a frontal shot as opposed to a shot from behind him.
Right. It's a very good question, and I must tell you that when I first saw the Zapruder film, and most of us, you know, I've only seen 2 people ever killed in my life, actually killed on film. One was President Kennedy, and the other is Lee Harvey Oswald. Beyond that, I've only seen westerns and films on TV and cop shows about the way people should react. So I really don't know, as most of us don't know, how people react when they're really shot by bullets. What happens in this case, and it's very interesting, you watch the film, and as you said, the president appears to move back violently into the left, and you would imagine that he was shot from the front. On an enhanced version of the Zapruder film, and this is key, when the president is shot, frames 312, 313, he moves forward 2.5 inches when the bullet enters his head. You measure that from the rear of the seat to where his back is as it moves forward, and then an explosion takes place out the right side of his head. This is graphic, and I'm sorry, but there's no other way to describe it. There's a red cloud, a mist almost, that forms in front of his head. That's brain and blood, and that is moving forward and away from the direction of the bullet as it shoots out the front of his head. Several things happen at that moment, according to the forensics doctors. First, remember, President Kennedy's wrapped in a back brace. It's tied under his chest and wrapped around his legs. It keeps him propped up to a certain extent. When the cortex of the brain is destroyed, the body goes into a neuromuscular seizure. Impulses go down the spine, the back muscles predominate, the body starts to twitch, and then this explosion takes place instantaneously out the right side of the head. Dr. Louis Alvarez, the Nobel Prize-winning physicist, calculated the force of the bullet going into Kennedy's head versus the force of the material blowing out of his skull, and calls it the jet effect. Just like a jet engine is propelled as material moves away from it. As that explosion, that wound takes place out the right front, it pushes Kennedy in the opposite direction, back into the left. And that's exactly what we see on the Zapruder film.
Thanks very much, Little Rock. Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. You're on with Gerald Posner.
Hello. Well, first of all, I want to commend Gerald Posner for bringing some sanity into this whole discussion. And what I'd like to ask him is this, and this is what I always ask the conspiracists. For them to be correct, there would have to be literally dozens and dozens of people have lied to conceal this. And what I'd like to know, have you done any numbers on this? That is, the number of people who would have had to deliberately cover this up and the likelihood of none of them, especially ones on their deathbed, not confessing to have covered this up.
Absolutely, and it numbers in the hundreds. Pittsburgh, you raise a very interesting question. There have been over 30 gunmen named by name or confessing to being the second gunman at Dealey Plaza, and none of them turn out to be, even including Frank Sinatra's drummer, who was named by one conspiracy. And when you talk about the numbers, we are talking about hundreds. According to the conspiracy theories, depending on which one you're choosing, the autopsy x-rays and photos have been forged. Kennedy's base x-rays, which proved that these are real, were replaced in all his medical offices. A team of surgeons covertly altered the body. The autopsy team is a group of phonies. The Secret Service was involved because they had lax security on their route. The Dallas police were involved because they allowed Ruby in. You start to multiply the numbers, and you're literally talking about several hundred. It's astonishing to me that this has become one of the myths of the conspiracy, together with one other thing. You know, one of the things we hear often that is a myth of conspiracy is that people who were close to the assassination, who witnessed something, died mysteriously, that they were somehow killed.
I'm going to ask you about that, all about all those untimely deaths.
Right, the so-called mystery deaths. Dorothy Kilgallen interviewed Ruby, was about to blow the lid off the case, and she died suddenly. I have a special appendix on all of the so-called mystery deaths, 103 in total. The conspiracy buffs say it turns out to be 101. They count 2 of them twice. There isn't a single mystery death. More than half of them are natural causes of people 20 years after the assassination. There's not a single witness who saw something unusual who ends up dying in a way that we can't explain. So this is also, as you said, part of the problem that I think has become ingrained in our thought process, but just isn't true.
The book, Case Closed, Lee Harvey Oswald and the Assassination of JFK by Gerald Posner, the publisher Random House. You can get it in most major bookstores or order it at 1-800-831-8900. Call day or night and charge it to any major credit card. We'll be back with our remaining moments with Gerald Posner after these messages.